So the next category for this unit is emotion. So we finished motivation and now we're moving on to emotion. Before we can talk about the theories of emotion, we need to talk about what emotions are. So what makes up an emotion? Well, emotions are a mixture of physiological activation, so our body actually becoming aroused, the expressive behaviors, so what we're actually doing on the outside of our body, and then the conscious experience, so our thoughts about the um, emotion. So the different theories of emotion are going to talk about what causes us to have an emotion. Well, William James and Carl Lang, the James Lang theories kind of took the opposite of the common sense approach. Basically, what they said is that our body has a physiological response. And then after our body has that physiological response, then we have an emotional experience. So our bodily changes cause us to feel emotions. That's the James Lang theory. So let's look at an example. So here you see a snake. That's your stimulus. Your body has a physiological response. Your heart rate increases, your breathing increases, etc., etc. That physiological response then causes you to feel fear. That's the James Lang theory. Physiological response first, then the emotions. Cannon-Bard came along and said, well, I'm not so sure on that. I think that the physiological response and the emotional experience are happening at the exact same time. The thalamus is producing both our physical response and an emotional idea at the same time. Okay? So let's look at an example of this. So you have a surprise party and you walk in the door and everyone says, surprise, happy birthday. What Cannon and Bard say is that our physiological response of our heart rate increasing, our breathing increasing, happens at the very same time of us experiencing surprise. Okay? So that's the Cannon-Bard theory. They happen at the same time. James Lang says physiological comes first, then the emotion. Cannon and Bard happens at the same time. Two-factor theory, which is also called the Schachter-Singer theory, said that, well, you know what? The physiological response has to come first. However, we also need to add in that cognition, the thinking part of it. There's two factors to emotion, the physiological response and the cognitive label that we place on that physiological response. Okay, so what's our example? So we hear thunder from a thunderstorm. Our physiological response is that our heartbeat increases, the breathing increases. Our cognitive label is that, oh no, I'm afraid of a thunderstorm. This was scary in the past. Now I feel fear again. Okay? So in order for us to feel that emotion of fear, we have to label it as something that is scary. That's what the two-factor theory is stating. However, there's a problem with this. The problem with us saying that the physiological response leads to an emotion is that physiological responses are pretty much similar across major emotions. Fear, anger, love, boredom, all of those things are kind of the same. Think about it. You're at a Packer game. The Packers are on the goal line and Aaron Rodgers has the ball and there's an opening and he's about to run towards the end zone. What happens to your body? Your breathing increases, your heart rate increases, your hands might get sweaty, right? That is happening to your body. But now let's think you're in a haunted house. You're about to walk around a corner. It's completely pitch black. What's happening to your body? Your heart rate increases, your breathing increases, your palms are sweaty, right? Those things are the same thing. So how do we determine the difference between excitement and fear? Well, we need to think about it. We need to be able to think, oh, yeah, that I should be afraid in this situation. Oh, I should be happy or excited in this situation. Okay? But because there are psychological or physiological similarities, there's also physiological differences. We know that our physical responses to fear, rage, and joy do differ slightly in our finger temperature as well as our facial muscles and how they are changing. Our amygdala also shows differences in how much it is activated during different emotional responses. Okay, so what is the connection between how we think and how we feel? What's the connection between these two? Well, we're going to look at it, okay? So we're going to look at these different theories. Now, all of these different theories are kind of bringing in the idea that we do need to think about things. We need to have some sort of cognitive appraisal of a situation. Now, an appraisal, when you make an appraisal, it means you're making some sort of judgment about the situation, okay? So we're going to look at 4 different ideas. So Zajonc and Ledoux, they both emphasize that some emotions happen immediately without us actually thinking about them. Okay, so they're going to argue that an emotional response can happen without us thinking about something. Lazarus and Schachter and Singer emphasize that we need to have some sort of cognitive thought about the emotion before we can actually determine that it's an emotion. Okay, so let's look at each of these separately. Zajonc says that some emotions happen before we can think about them. Basically, we feel before we think. You are walking in the forest and you feel scared because you hear a twig crack before you even have time to think about that twig cracking and whether or not you're scared. Your body is already feeling afraid before you can think about that twig cracking. Most neurological research supports this idea that there are neural pathways that bypass the cortical areas involved in thinking, meaning that we have neural connections that go straight from like our eyes to our amygdala that would bypass any sort of thinking areas of our brain. Basically, we're having an emotional response without thinking about it, okay? Ledoux added to this, and he said that, yep, there are some routes that go straight to the amygdala. Basically, we are going to not think about it. It's going to happen. That emotional response happens immediately. However, we also have cortical or conscious thought responses as well. So think about fear. You can have that immediate fear response, but you can also have fear that comes from you thinking about a situation too much, right? So you being in the woods and hearing a twig crack is an immediate fear response, but then you sitting in your bedroom thinking about the murder show that you watched last night is going to lead you to be afraid in your own bedroom. Okay? So that's what Ledoux is saying, that fear can happen subconsciously as well as consciously. Okay, Lazarus came in and said, hey, we cannot have an emotional response without thinking about it. It's like, I get it. Some of these responses happen super quick. However, in order for us to actually feel an emotion, we have to think about it. Otherwise, how do we know what we're responding to? He's saying this appraisal might be effortless, and we might not be conscious of this appraisal happening, but it's still happening. So upon hearing a twig crack, you have to appraise the situation as one that's dangerous in order for you to feel scared in the woods, right? So if you hear that twig crack when you're alone and it's dark and you don't know where you are in the woods, you're going to appraise that situation as dangerous, therefore you're afraid. However, if you're in the woods with your friends in the middle of the day and it's an area you've been in forever and you hear a twig crack, you're not going to be as afraid. That's what Lazarus is saying. Okay, let's look at the dimensions of emotion. I'm sorry, I don't know why it says white up there. Just ignore that. So our emotions have 2 dimensions, okay? We have our valence and our arousal. I want you to look at valence as like the positive or negative side of an emotion. So whether it's a positive emotion or a negative emotion. And then arousal is how intense the emotion is. So our emotions can happen on different dimensions. So we can have very intense positive emotions, but we can also have very unintense, like basic positive emotions, right? We can have very intense negative emotions, or we can have very low intensity emotions, right? That's what this idea is saying in the dimensions of emotion.